My dear friend Eleanor was a warm, loving wife, mother, and grandmother, a marvelous hostess, and a very special friend. She was also a great teacher and a wonderful gardener. I met her in September of 1954 when we both taught at Chilliwack Central School. Eleanor and I were single then. Over the years, as our lives and families grew, we were constantly together. I spent many happy hours in her gardens. Eleanor's garden supplied flowers for my wedding, and it was in her garden Gary and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. Eleanor's gardens were laid out with an artist's eye. Her beds had curves and shapes that kept the eye focused. The plants were varied. She had something of interest blooming for every season. Books were studied to find shade plants for shady areas, sun-loving plants for bright sunny areas. Also, there had to be lots of flowering plants that were good for cutting. Bouquets were displayed throughout her home and given to others for many occasions. Eleanor was always looking for new ideas and new hardy plants. In 1979, we moved into our house on East 20th Street. There was a garden on every side of the house, but what a garden! The woman who had lived in the house for close to 20 years had not believed in removing anything that started to grow in her garden. This woman was no Eleanor. We took 22 loads of garden refuse to the dump that first spring and summer. There was much consulting with Eleanor. We would walk through her garden and she would say, "You need a piece of this plant. It has lots of color and spreads well." Or, "This plant will do well in your shady areas." She would come into my garden and say, "Oh, we must keep this plant. Just cut it back and move it over to this area." Or, "We'll put a piece of my coreopsis in this area to start." Slowly, over time, things began to change in the rough, unkempt garden. As my new garden grew, so did I. I studied gardening books and learned names of plants. I learned how to prepare beds for planting and how to build up the soil. I learned to divide and move perennials in early spring. I learned to feed my plants. I learned environmentally friendly ways of protecting plants from bugs and disease. Eleanor began taking pieces of plants I had established. When I look at my garden now, I have straight lines where Eleanor had curved ones, but I do have drifts of seasonal color and contrasting shapes and textures. I also know that a garden is a work in progress and it will never be complete. Eleanor taught me to garden. Plants from my garden are now in gardens of relatives and friends throughout the North Shore. They've traveled to other gardens in the Fraser Valley and Okanagan and been sent on from there. I've realized that what Eleanor taught me, I have passed on to others. Her garden became part of my garden, and my garden has become part of others. Eleanor died in March 1999. Her garden remains.